when you get people together to be able to talk about and solve an issue or a series of issues, when you get them in the room, you don't say, who's got an idea? What you do is you say, here are some pads of paper. I want you to put down your 3 ideas and write it down so nobody's conferring with anybody. So at least it gives them the ability to brain dump. And now you have some differentiation to compare it to. Welcome to the Nice Business Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Train, executive coach, leadership and culture consultant, and I'm joined by my good friend, Jim Bob Howard, veteran technical consultant. Together, we have more than 60 years combined of business and organizational experience. The purpose of this podcast is to have short but meaningful discussions about the people and culture side of business and how owners and executives can be both kind and successful. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Nice Business Podcast. I'm Richard Train and I'm here with my co-host Jim Bob Howard, longtime friend, and we are thrilled to welcome Art Markman. And Art Markman is a longtime professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin on human dimensions of organizations and marketing. And now, Art, I believe you are now working with the Minerva Project in Los Angeles. And we had a fantastic conversation the other day, a lot about something that you're very passionate about, and that's the intersection between creativity for organizations and efficiency, and really what the difference is between those for any kind of organization, large or small. So I would love to kind of set you up for an introduction of yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Jim Bob, it's great to be here talking with you today. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I spend my time studying the way people think and trying to understand how we think as individuals, how we work together effectively as teams, and try to build trust in organizations, and how organizations can be a little bit more innovative in the things that they do. And all of that work has led to a really interesting observation about the way that a lot of companies and in the US really function, which is we tend to optimize for efficiency. We want to be lean and mean. We want to do more with less. We want to make sure that we are maximizing the profits that we can get from the revenues that we bring in. And so when you do that, you really focus on, is everybody working fully? Are they utilizing all of their capacities? Are we finding easier ways to do the things that we do all the time? And yet, it is often the case that these same companies will talk about their desire to be innovative, to really lead in their market in some way. In fact, I spent 27 years living in Austin, Texas, and I think it was a city ordinance that if you were a company in Austin, you had to say something about innovation in your mission statement. It was simply a requirement. And the funny thing about that is that these two tendencies, the desire to be innovative and the need for efficiency that we instill in so many organizations, are actually pulling at each other in ways that a lot of people don't recognize, because fundamentally, both the psychology of creativity as well as the business of innovation are fundamentally inefficient things to do. And if you don't recognize that up front, then you are going to be doomed to desire innovation without ever actually getting any of that innovation.
Very excellent points. I appreciate that. And one thing that I'm curious about, what do you think the correlation is between the maturity of the company with relation to innovation? Don't you usually find, or at least in my experience, I've found that younger companies tend to be more innovative until they kind of get their feet under themselves and they start thinking, God, we're spending a lot of money.
Yeah, I think until they get HR as a function, really. Yeah, a lot of times you start a business up, and in order to get recognized in your industry, you've got to do something new and different. Because otherwise, people are going to go back and work with the tried and true people who are already in that industry. And so you've got to bring something new to the table. And it's much easier to do that sort of innovative work when you're a small company, because, everybody in a small company does everything. You don't have the luxury of passing something off to somebody else. And so you've got everybody talking to each other. The people highest in the organization also understand what it means to be on the front lines. And so there's just a lot of real teamwork that goes into those organizations, and they're not particularly efficient because everyone's just doing whatever needs to be done whenever it needs to be done. As you get larger, as you get more specialized, you start thinking about, okay, are we making the best use of our resources? Are we hiring exactly the number of people that we need? And my crack about HR, there's something to be said about that, right? I mean, HR is going to say, when you say, well, we needed to hire a new person, they're going to say, well, do we need that new person? And often that justification comes in the form of, do we have enough business that we are billing at a place where that person can be afforded, and there isn't really anybody else who could pick up that slack. Here's the problem. The When you're trying to be creative, you have to do a lot of things that have no obvious purpose in the moment. In fact, that was codified years ago. Google used to talk about how they were giving their employees 20% time. And what they meant by that was that they were going to allow their employees to have about 20% of their time spent on projects that weren't currently related to revenue generating projects. Now, it's not clear they ever actually did that, right? I mean, I think if you look at the stories, it's not obvious that they did, but let's imagine for a moment that they did do that. If you were to give your employees 20% of their time, one day a week as an equivalent, to do things that are just, let me try some stuff, you need to have 20% more employees than you need just to do the work that you're billing. And most organizations would never allow themselves to have 20% more people than they actually need. And so, what this recognizes is that innovation requires and creativity requires a certain amount of overcapacity. If you look at the history of innovations, a lot of times you find that the most innovative people are the ones who just know stuff, and not just know stuff in their area of expertise, they know stuff in general. I've written about this a little bit and called these folks expert generalists. They just learn things, and they're not sure why they learned them, but eventually they discover that some of the things that they know give them an insight into a new problem that nobody else has, because they just happen to have this additional expertise. And the problem is, a lot of times, like, even organizations that style themselves as learning organizations, they'll allow their employees to go and take a class somewhere, but they'll ask them to justify that class by, what is it about this knowledge or these skills that's going to be crucial for the job you're doing? And that's the wrong question.
Yeah.
If somebody says, I want to learn something, just let them learn it. And you'll figure out later why it was useful.
How it applies. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's an inefficiency, right? In fact, years ago, I used to do some consulting for Procter and Gamble. Mm-hmm. And P&G has a certain number of their employees who are very often involved in innovative projects. And they've actually given these employees a designation that's named after a guy named Victor Mills. And Vic Mills was an innovator at P&G. He's the one who brought Pampers into being and was involved in a huge number of different innovative projects. And since then, the folks who are really involved in a lot of innovations become Vic Mills fellows. And they just wander around the company and try and catalyze innovations. When you talk to them, I actually gave some personality tests to them and some other things. What you find is three interesting things. They are very high in a personality characteristic called openness to experience, which means that they love new things, new ideas. They're very high in another characteristic called need for cognition, which means they like to think about stuff. So not only do they think new things are fun, they just like to think about them. And then, and this is important, they are moderate to low in another characteristic called conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is how likely are you to finish the stuff you started and to follow the rules. And so what happens is these folks, you told them to do one thing, and they spent their time thinking about another thing and talking to somebody at the water cooler and doing these other things. And initially, that's not so great, because if you're a frontline manager, you want your people to do what you ask them to do. Right. But eventually, these people compile a huge knowledge base of interesting things, not just interesting things in the world, but also interesting things that are going on elsewhere in the company. And so then they notice things that nobody else has seen. And that's part of what enables them to then develop ideas that become the next billion-dollar brand at a company like P&G. And so you have to have at least a certain number of these folks who are doing things really inefficiently in order to have those catalysts for doing things that are more creative. And Richard, to bring this full circle, right, I do think that in smaller companies, we tolerate that a little bit more. In larger companies, we tend to be very regimented in the way that people do their jobs. And so, in fact, when I interviewed these Vic Mills fellows, one of them said to me, I have succeeded at this company despite the system, not because of it.
So let me ask you this, Art, as I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, okay, if I owned a company and man, I really want that innovation, but I also have shareholders and I have a CFO who is like, hey, how do we keep our costs down? And I have to figure out where's that balance, or how do I let my efficiencies where it makes sense, and how do I determine where to be efficient? How do
Yep.
I let the efficiency not only pay for just the day-to-day running of the business and the normal profit, but also this extra pool that allows me to be inefficient for innovation purposes?
Yeah.
How do I get that balance, or how do I get
Yeah.
to a point where I can say or even tell shareholders, hey, we've been super efficient over here, so we can be super inefficient over there, so we can come up with the next billion-dollar idea?
Yeah. And I think the first thing you have to do is to introduce the idea that when you want to be a little bit more creative, a little bit more innovative, you're going to have to be inefficient. So you have to start by introducing that so that people understand that there's going to be a trade-off there.
Yeah.
The next thing you want to do is to really be very clear about which aspects of your business are really involved turning a crank to do things the way you did them last time, effectively, efficiently, and in the easiest possible way. There's always a part of any business that is just the routine pieces of it.
Yeah.
And those routine pieces, you want to identify those and say, you know what, we do those well and we do them repeatably so that you're getting a consistent experience, you're getting a consistent engagement on those elements. So there's no reason to innovate on those. Actually, a buddy of mine from Procter & Gamble, a guy by the name of Craig Wynette, who was their chief learning officer for many years, he used to say, look, the creativity is not something you want everywhere. He said, the last thing you want is to get on the plane and hear the flight attendant say, our pilot today is Captain Smith. He's our most creative pilot.
No.
Right? And
Or
and
you're
and I,
serving
He
a
loves
hard surgeon
barrel
today is going
rolls.
to try something completely new.
That's right. That's right. Please just do what you did last time.
Right.
Crying out
Yeah.
loud. Just take off and land. That's all I want. And so if you identify here are the places where efficiency should rule, then what you're doing is saying we're going to maximize our profit margin in the areas in which we are going to be just living in our bread and butter.
Yeah.
And then here are the places where we want to innovate. And that's the place where we're going to need some overcapacity, where we're going to have to be willing to try some things that may not work. And one of the things that I used to tell my teams, I worked in the provost's office for many years at the University of Texas and in our academic affairs, led our academic affairs team. And when we tried something new, I would say to the team, hey, look, let's just get a B- and then fix it.
Yeah.
Let's get in there and try some things. They may not work completely initially, but we'll pay attention, we'll gather the right kind of data to fix it, and then we will improve it over time. So we'll get an A in the end, but the thing we launch is not going to be perfect. And you have to acknowledge that innovation is going to require those fits and starts, and a certain number of those things that you shot for a B- ended up being a D, and you got to pull the plug on them. But that's part of it. And so if you acknowledge that's going to happen when you're being innovative, but you're going to be really good, crisp, and efficient on the things that need to be done repeatably, then you have, I think, a recipe for success and a recipe that your CFO might go for.
Yeah.
Interesting. So that's great when it comes to larger organizations like a P&G. So say that I'm a small company and I don't have shareholders and I don't have a board of directors, and it's just me and like a vice president, maybe a sales manager and a team.
Yeah.
And we're doing okay. We kind of hit our stride. We're doing okay, but sales are kind of flat. Everything's kind of flat. And we know that we need to do something.
Yeah.
How would this kind of apply to that level of a company?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even there, you want to recognize strategically, here are the places where we're going to have to try something new if we're going to succeed. And I think part of what you have to do also is ask yourself, what are we trying to be when we grow up? Or are we trying to grow up at all?
Right.
Right? I mean, sales that are flat could be fine. There's plenty of companies that make a living because they sell to a customer base that remains reasonably solid. Few new customers, few people leave, but you've got a pretty steady customer base and you're going to serve those people. I mean, I've just met a wonderful dry cleaner down the street from me. There's nothing innovative about the business. And,
Right.
a new person moves in the neighborhood, needs some shirts cleaned, and they come. Somebody moves out of the neighborhood, they leave. Sales are probably pretty flat, but you know what? He's making a good living. And so, not everything needs to be innovative. But if you're looking at your business and thinking, gosh, we've got 18 employees right now and we'd love to be 50 or 60, and there is a sweet spot there, where growing to a size of, 50 to 100 gives you a certain amount of resilience to economic shocks and things like that, because, you're not just going to, the valleys aren't going to cause you to go under. And if you're trying to grow to that level and you think, we really are going to have to do something new, then, one of the ways to do it is to designate a certain area of the business. And maybe if you've got, if you're in that 15 employee range, designate 2 or 3 people as being your core innovation team. And they may still interview everybody else and talk with them and try and gather insights from everybody, but you're not necessarily putting everybody into that basket. So you can do something that is similar to what the large companies are doing, but just say, look, this segment of the business, we're just going to keep generating the money that's going to keep the lights on. And then we're going to gamble a little bit with some of this money around the edges to try something new. I think the other thing is, I think looking at interesting strategic partnerships for small businesses can be very helpful there as well. Sometimes it can be a consultant who can come in and maybe provide some expertise you don't currently have. Sometimes it can be, what falls under the heading of what they call a co-opetition, where you sit down with somebody who is theoretically a competitor, but they're more adjacent than they are direct competition, and
Right.
work with them to see whether there's actually a partnership you could create that might strengthen both organizations, and where you can share a little bit of the burden and risk associated with the innovation so that it doesn't fall squarely on one company. And it's a way of making your company feel a little bit larger for the purposes of trying to innovate.
Interesting. Yeah. Like potentially pooling, buying, purchasing power or something like that.
Yeah.
You're not competing for necessarily the same client base or something like that.
That's right. Or you might actually be able to go after the same client base together by innovating together. You're doing things that turn out to be more complementary than competitive. And by getting together with them, you might be able to create an offering that neither of you would really be able to do alone. But together, you actually could create an offering that allows you to remain distinct entities. But by working together, you actually bring something that nobody else is doing at the moment.
Interesting. What about if you are in an industry that gets hit by some sort of a significant downturn? I don't want to bring up something like COVID because that kind of hit everybody differently, but it hit everybody. But say it's something else that hits a particular industry, a downturn in the housing market or home improvement or something like that. What are some strategies that businesses can try to approach in order to figure out ways to innovate?
I think downturns are often the best time to innovate. I think a lot of people are afraid to do it because they're trying to keep the lights on and trying to really weather the storm. But I talk to students a lot, or I've talked to students a lot over the years, and every time there's an economic downturn, I end up, doing these panel discussions for students. And one of the things I always tell them is things are never as bad as they seem when times are bad. They're never as good as they seem when times are good.
Right.
When things get bad, I think the thing you have to remember is it's called a business cycle for a reason. It's going to get better. And really, the aim is let's be ready to hit that upcycle at the time that the economy begins to improve. In fact, during COVID, when COVID hit, I was serving as the executive director of something called the IC Squared Institute, which is an economic development think tank at the University of Texas. And we had shifted our focus to think about small and rural communities and economic development in those areas. And of course, the backbone of a lot of these small communities is small to medium-sized business.
Right.
And so we had actually gone and done something we called the Rural Economic Recovery Initiative, where we went to a lot of these smaller towns and started to talk to them about what are some of the ways that you could think about doing things differently when the inevitable recovery comes, and try and get ahead of the curve. So I think when times are bad, you're gonna spend a lot of frustrating time doing the same thing over and over if you continue doing the same thing over and over again, and with not a lot to show for it. It's not a bad time to say, you know what, we're going to still try to sell some stuff because we need some money to come in. But rather than pounding the pavement and being frustrated most of the time, let's actually put our heads together and think about where are some of the missed opportunities? Where are some of the things that we've always said, gosh, if we only had the time, we would do things differently in the following way, or it would be great if only somebody would do a particular thing, and use the downtime in the industry to start retooling for that.
Yeah.
So that when the inevitable moment comes that people are buying again, that the sector does begin to pick up, that you're actually there and ready to launch something new and put a new face on what you're doing, that when you catch that upswing, actually may greatly enhance the revenue. And I think a lot of small companies think, well, if only we could get big enough, we would innovate more. And I actually think taking advantage of the downturns as a small company is a great time to do that innovation, because the sad fact is, if you hit an upswing and you start selling a bunch of stuff, what you're really going to say is, let's do more of that. Right? It's going to be drill, baby, drill, right? And that's the point at which you're actually going to want to get more efficient at the things that you're selling well. So if you kind of reverse the way a lot of people are thinking about this and really try to innovate in some of the downtimes and then ride the wave when it comes, you put yourself in a position of potentially being able to provide some unique offerings when markets return.
Excellent point. Let me just ask you this. Are there specific kinds of programs that companies that are looking for help in innovating that they can sign on to or learn from? Where can they go to get help with innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's several things that you can do. I mean, one is to really invest in your people and invest in their knowledge and skills, and to do it in a way that tries to really broaden the base of knowledge and skills of the people that you have in your company. So you want to be doing that all the time. And, I think most colleges and universities now have done a nice job of building continuing education programs where you can go and take a seminar for a day or a week and develop some skills or polish up some knowledge. And I think doing some of that is making sure that you're devoting some budget to that and not really telling most of your people, this is the thing you've got to learn. I mean, sometimes you need to remediate something that's a problem with somebody, or, somebody's being groomed for a leadership role and you need them to learn some management skills. But a lot of times, just give people the freedom to learn something that they're excited about. You never know where there's going to be a great idea because somebody got exposed to a piece of information. I think that's the first piece. I think the second thing is that if you're a company that doesn't frequently innovate, I think there are a certain number of, even private consultants who will come in and work with you to get you to do the kinds of things that are correlated with real creativity. And so some amount of that is, for example, a lot of times when we want to be creative, we say, well, let's brainstorm something. And it turns out group brainstorming is a disaster, right? There's actually it's actually well known so the term brainstorming comes from a guy named Alex Osborne, who wrote a book on business processes in the 50s. And he laid out what we think of as the rules of brainstorming. Right, which is throw out as many ideas as you can, don't worry about the constraints, build on everybody else's ideas. And it seemed really cool and everybody loves it. Back in the 60s, psychologists started asking the question, so does it work? If you follow Osborne's rules of brainstorming, do you actually get better performance. And there is a term of art in the psychology literature, not a term of art, but a term of art in the psychology literature called productivity loss from brainstorming. So it
Yeah.
turns out that in many studies, if you get a bunch of people following these standard rules of brainstorming, those groups come up with fewer ideas and fewer good ideas than the individuals would have come up with had they worked alone. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and we probably do a whole other show on that. But I think the fact is that there are some simple things you can do to be better at generating ideas. For example, having everybody work alone when you want them to think differently, because part of what happens with groups is they tend to converge in the way that they say it, in the way that they think about things. Having somebody who really understands what it means to foster creativity. How do you create these days? I think that, we talk a lot about this notion of psychological safety, of creating an organization that in which people are willing to try and say a thing that may not sound so smart when they first say it, but turns out to have the germ of a great idea in it. So, how do you build an organization that is tolerant of new ideas in ways that actually promotes that kind of creativity? And, most of us, unfortunately, don't really understand how that works, in part because if you think about your science education that you got growing up, you probably studied biology, chemistry, and physics. I love biology, chemistry, and physics. I'm a big fan, but most of us will never split an atom. We probably won't mix a bunch of chemicals at work, and we won't
Hopefully not
dissect much.
again.
Yeah. But we are virtually guaranteed to come across other people. And yet we don't really study any psychology in grade school, often in college.
Right.
And so we don't get any of that science base that would give us insight into all the people that we're working with. And so having people who are more skilled at understanding the way that the dynamics of organizations get created so that you are giving yourself the best possible chance to be innovative. I mean, even simple things like what I was saying earlier about telling my teams, look, when we launch this thing, we're just going to get a B minus. That's actually a powerful thing because a lot of times you're coming up with this innovative idea.
On your shoulders.
Right. Everybody's thinking, well, what if something goes wrong? And what you're telling them when you say we're trying to get a B minus is, look, stuff's going to go wrong. We expect stuff to go wrong. We're not doing anything innovative if nothing goes wrong. So the real trick is recovering from those errors. And, what's interesting is in school, K to 12, the people who are most successful in school, and actually even in college often, the people who are most successful are the ones who make the fewest mistakes. So success in school is about mistake minimization, and success in life is about mistake recovery. And we have to help people to recognize that when something goes wrong, that's just the starting point for another process of fixing it and not a sign of some kind of massive failure.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love that. Honestly, I'm making some notes here. My wife is an artist, and one of the things that she's struggled with, because she's, for most of her life, she's been raising the kids and taking care of the home. And now that we're empty nesters, she's getting back into art and learning to get back to playing. Right. And that's really kind of the focus of, people say, well, like my 5-year-old could have done that. I'm like, really? Let's see what they do. Because that's actually a compliment, because that means that they were not afraid of making mistakes. It's what you do with those. And I've heard this analogy too, or maybe it was, I don't know if it was the exact class, or it was definitely class that actually happened, or if it's just, one of those anecdotes. But there was a photography class that the professor divided everybody in half and said, okay, this half is going to be graded on the quality of your photos. And this half is going to be graded on the quantity of your photos. And the ones that were graded on quantity had better quality. Because they were taking more pictures. They're taking more pictures. They're taking more pictures. They see what worked, what wasn't working. It was okay to make mistakes. Whereas the other ones are like, oh, I got to get it perfect. I got to get it perfect every time. And that pressure kept them from being innovative and kept them from doing the excellent work that the practice gave them. And so just the fact that K through 12 and even into college is about mistake minimization, and you feel that. I feel that with younger employees that come into our organization. They feel like they can't make mistakes. They can't make mistakes. I'm like, please make mistakes. And then let's talk about how we can do it better, how we'll do it better next time. How do we even recover from this, right? And a lot of the mistakes that they're afraid of making are not anything that needs to be recovered from. Like it's fine.
Yeah.
It's not even that big of a deal. It's like, oh, you misworded something, or that one was blue instead of red. I'm like, okay, we can fix that because it's not really a fix. It's just a change, right? And that's just realizing that the main part of life is mistake recovery. And so many times I work with people and they're so afraid of making mistakes. They're so afraid of making mistakes.
Oh, yeah. And, those people you think of as the most creative, they have a lot of bad ideas. In fact, the point you're making about quantity, there's a pretty consistent finding in all of the studies on creativity that the people and the groups that have the best ideas are the ones that have the most ideas.
Yes.
And because it turns out you don't really know whether an idea is a good one until after you get it out.
Yeah.
There isn't really a process of editing that and throwing away all the bad ones and
just
keeping
keep the good stuff. Yeah.
And I tell people, anybody who's listened to the latter half of the Beatles' White Album knows that even the Beatles wrote a lot of bad songs.
Oh, yeah.
It's okay, right? Because they also wrote a lot of great ones. They wrote a lot of stuff. And that's, it's important to recognize that. And I think a lot of times we get intimidated by people we see as really creative because what we see in the end is just the product of their creativity. So we see the great piece of artwork,
not the iterations.
No, not the iterations,
and not all the false starts.
Yeah,
situations where somebody started something and went, no, that's done,
and the layers lower down on the canvas before they painted the thing that you really like. All of the stuff that was the buildup behind that.
Right. That's right. And so if all you ever see is somebody's finished product, then you're missing all of the stuff that got them there. And then you're judging yourself against an impossible standard.
I think it's interesting, going back to what you were talking about before about groups getting together and brainstorming and everything, and the dangers of groupthink. And that kind of it reminds me, Jim Bob, of the conversation that we had about about losing your best people and all of that.
Yeah.
One of the topics that we talked about on the podcast here. And one of the things that we talked about was something that I've done from a consultant standpoint is when you get people together to be able to talk about and solve an issue or a series of issues, is you make sure that when you get them in the room, you don't say, who's got an idea? What you do is you say, here are some pads of paper. I want you to put down your 3 ideas and write it down, so nobody's conferring with anybody. So at least it gives them the ability to brain dump.
Yeah.
And now you have some differentiation to compare it to. And so thank you for that validation. I appreciate it.
Yeah. In fact, I'll add one thing to that, which is there's a really wonderful technique you can do that's called 635, where you actually expand on that by getting everybody at the table. They write their 3 ideas down. And then before you start showing them to everybody, you pass them to the person to your left and you get them to build on it. And if you've got 6 people at the table, you pass them 5 times. Everybody sees everything. Nobody's actually talked to anybody yet. And that technique, if you look at the studies, is actually not just better than traditional brainstorming. It's better than having everybody work alone.
Yeah, I've done that before too. It's fantastic.
I love it. Yeah, it's highly recommended. And part of what's nice about it is when you just have people write an idea down, then there's inevitably every group's got the narcissist in it who needs to have their idea win. And the beauty of a technique like 635 is that by the time everybody's trodden on everybody else's ideas, nothing is recognizably anybody's anymore. And so the narcissist gets defanged because they've got nothing to fight for anymore.
That's great. Well, and conversely, the one who's the wallflower and is afraid to share their ideas, theirs gets some merit too, because people actually reason across it because it's actually been said. Where if they were a quiet voice in the room before, their idea still gets passed by everybody.
That's right. Yeah.
It's part of the whole.
That's right.
No, that's fantastic. So let me ask you, if you had to leave our viewers, our listeners, with one major thought on something that they could do tomorrow to help them with their innovation versus efficiency and make it to where it's doable, what would that be?
I'll give you 2 things. The one is what people can do as individuals, and then the other is what somebody can try organizationally. And I think as an individual, everyone should just read about something they don't know anything about or do a thing they don't know anything about. In my mid-30s, I took up the saxophone, learned a ton, and actually ended up in I did a book called Bring Your Brain to Work a while back, and I actually included a bunch of insights I got from learning to play jazz for organizations. I never thought that I would get any professional benefit from learning to play the sax, but there you go. It happened. And I think organizationally, I think obviously you want to engage in good business practice. You don't want your business to go under. But I think we have to put a little sign up, particularly business leaders need a little sign that says the goal isn't always to maximize profits today. And I think that we have to remember that. And frankly, most of us are not running publicly traded companies where we have to answer solely to a group of shareholders who are going to punish us for inefficiency. This is actually one of the reasons why publicly traded companies often become less innovative. But it's one of the reasons why a company like Dell had to go private in order to rethink its whole business model. But I think most of us aren't doing that. So that reminder that the most important number is not always the profit number is freeing in really beginning to think strategically, what are we trying to accomplish?
Fantastic. I love it. So let me ask you then, this is fantastic. We could have talked about this all day. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah, it's an exciting time. I am a big believer in innovation in the space of higher education. When I was working as running our academic affairs team at the University of Texas, we were really focused on what are some of the things we could do to improve the quality of the education. How do we get our students to really recognize the skills that are a fundamental part of a college degree program? And so I did that. I had a wonderful time. And, you can't stay in a position forever. And I really came to a choice point where I had an opportunity. I could have tried to stay in higher education administration, love that work, but I felt like it would allow me at best to help one school at a time. And the alternative was to think about opportunities in the private sector. And I'm now working for Minerva Project. Minerva Project is a very innovative company. They actually started a university called Minerva University that really does try to help students to understand the deep skills that they're learning and to learn how to take all of their knowledge and try to apply it to whatever circumstance they find themselves in. And they make use of a lot of cognitive science, my home field. And so I feel like I'm well placed to be engaged with them because I have both the scientific background related to the core of what they do, as well as a lot of higher education administration background to understand how decisions get made at universities. And our aim is to try to help as many universities as possible that want to really rethink their curriculum, rethink how they are communicating to students about all the things they're learning. There's a real paradox in higher ed right now, which is that we know from the data that liberal arts majors do incredibly well in the workforce in the long run, but they often have difficulty getting that first job. They do well in the long run because they've learned a lot of really deep thinking skills. They're good systems thinkers. They're good communicators. They are good problem solvers. They're good at drawing analogies between one area of their expertise and another, often better than folks who've had other kinds of majors. But what they've learned is often embedded in a discipline like English or philosophy or history or any of the other liberal arts disciplines that is not directly related to the thing that they're going to do on day one when they get into the workplace. So they have to convince an employer to hire them. 5 years later, the employer is thrilled that they hired them and wish that they had 100 more, yet they still keep going and hiring business school students. And so a lot of this focus on how do we communicate about these really deep skills is there to help our college students bridge the gap between the major that they had and the needs of employers on day one so that there is less of a hiccup on graduation. And I think that helps to make our students more professional without professionalizing the education.
That's great.
That's fantastic. That's really exciting.
That is.
So if somebody has any questions for any of the studies that you were talking about, or if they want to do any other kind of research based on anything that we've talked about, how would somebody reach out to you?
These days, easiest way to find me is on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
I write a weekly for Fast Company. I write somewhat regularly for Psychology Today. I have a radio show and podcast of my own called Two Guys on Your Head. That's a 7.5-minute segment produced by our local NPR affiliate in Austin, Texas. And I post a lot of articles about this stuff, and I'm always happy to answer questions when people write to me. So if you get interested in this, then just reach out and we'll continue the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, Art, thank you very much for spending some time with us. This has been a great conversation. We could talk about this again sometime, anytime you have any kind of organizational, cognitive topic that you think would be a good topic of conversation, come on back.
Yeah.
Sounds like fun. Richard, Jim Bob, this was great.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Good. Thanks, Art.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Nice Business Podcast. We hope you got some valuable information and inspiration. We're always looking for great stories that will help your business be more kind and successful. And if you know of one we should hear or someone that would be a great interview, please let us know. To contact me, click the link here to go to my website or use this QR code. I wish you a nice business.